U.S. forces blast Afghanistan for a second night.
We will not stop until the terrorist networks are destroyed.
A first look at the damage and the violent reaction of bin Laden supporters outside Afghanistan. Plus, a CBS News exclusive. We take you inside the terror camps the U.S. is targeting. 2 cases of anthrax in one office. Now the FBI is on the case. And security around the United States tonight is tighter than ever.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Special extended coverage of America Fights Back. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. Round 2. U.S. forces pounded away for a second straight night at military and terrorist targets in Afghanistan, aiming to put Osama bin Laden's terror network and the Taliban dictatorship that supports it out of business. Assessing damage from the first night of bombing, the U.S. Defense Department says it is pleased and all U.S. personnel are reported to have returned safely. In this country, Attorney General Ashcroft warned police, businesses, and utilities today to remain on high alert. And as security is tightened, the FAA is limiting all air travelers now to 1 carry-on bag and 1 personal item. The Pentagon says U.S. and British forces struck 30 military targets in Afghanistan in the first day of the war. That was followed by airdrops of food and medicine for Afghan civilians. President Bush said the war so far has been executed as planned, but he added it will be a long war that will require patience. The president, who saw Osama bin Laden's videotaped message, says the war on terror goes beyond any one person. Protesters rampaged through some streets of Pakistan, protesting the government's support for the Allied attacks in neighboring Afghanistan. Tom Ridge was sworn in as director of the new cabinet-level Office of Homeland Security. He vowed the terrorists will not take away our way of life. But life has changed. Security was tightened further today in New York City and in airports all over the country. And most rail shipments of hazardous materials have been stopped temporarily. To bring you comprehensive coverage of the war on terrorism, CBS News has correspondents deployed in key locations around the world and across the United States. We begin with National Security Correspondent David Martin at the Pentagon. David?
Dan, the second day of airstrikes used essentially the same weapons as the first day, but it was a much smaller version.
The second day of airstrikes used only 10 carrier-based aircraft, 15 sea-launched cruise missiles, and 5 long-range bombers. About a third the size of the first day's strikes, which hit targets throughout Afghanistan.
All 30 sites that were struck were military installations, 3 were in Kabul, and 4 close to the other large settlements. But 23 were in remote areas of the country.
On the first day, B-2 bombers flying non-stop from the U.S. used satellite-guided bombs like these to crater the runways at Taliban airfields. But Defense Secretary Rumsfeld is not ready to declare the target destroyed.
I think it would be too soon to say that the Taliban air defenses and aircraft and airports have been fully disabled.
Another high-priority target is the facilities the Taliban uses to impose their hardline fundamentalist rule on Afghanistan.
We cannot yet state with certainty that we destroyed the dozens of military command and control and leadership targets we selected.
Taliban soldiers are shooting back with shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, but U.S. aircraft are flying higher than the missiles can reach. America has an overwhelming advantage in technology and firepower, but Rumsfeld says there are limits to what airstrikes can accomplish.
But I think it's unlikely that the airstrikes will rock the Taliban back on their heels, as you say. They have very few targets that are of high value, that are manageable from the air.
Airstrikes are only part of a much broader campaign to get rid of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden's network of terrorist training camps. Or as Rumsfeld describes it,
putting enough pressure on the situation so that eventually it creates a situation internally where it disintegrates and falls apart, and the people on the ground are then able to replace something that is obviously a serious cancer on that country.
Those people on the ground include rebels already fighting the Taliban for control of Afghanistan.
We are working with the elements on the ground that are interested in overthrowing and expelling that group of people.
The U.S. is already providing the Afghan rebels with intelligence, and by eliminating the Taliban Air Force, it will be giving them air cover as well. The U.S. is also airdropping food to starving Afghan civilians, innocent victims and potential sources of intelligence in the hunt for bin Laden.
The Pentagon does not yet have a good handle on how much damage the airstrikes have caused, but there's not much doubt they will eventually destroy everything that can be destroyed from the air. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. The United States has informed the United Nations Security Council that Afghanistan may not be the only country to face attack in the war on terrorism. A formal document declares that the U.S., quote, may find that our self-defense requires further actions with respect to other organizations and other states, unquote. For now, though, the task is clear, and it is in Afghanistan: the destruction of terrorist and Taliban forces. CBS's Jim Axelrod is watching the action from an anti-Taliban stronghold near Kabul, the Afghan capital, in the Panjshir Valley.
On the second night of American airstrikes, from our position some 20 miles north of Kabul, we've seen significantly more explosions over the capital. Orange glows followed by loud rumbling several seconds later. Kabul appears to have been hit even harder than last night.
At dawn, as the last of the first round of strikes finally gave way, the people of Kabul began to emerge, firing up the bread ovens and pumping badly needed water. For many, last night was too much. They loaded whatever they had into carts and began to leave. It was a terrible night. We all were scared here, says this young man. Against the backdrop of years of destruction, others started getting back to what passes for normal life in Kabul. Reporters were taken to what the Taliban said was a residential neighborhood hit in last night's strike. I was frightened, said this man, and so was my family. We want this to be stopped. But tonight, the bombing only intensified. Tomorrow morning will reveal new damage to this battered city.
The other major difference tonight, we've seen very little fighting between forces from the United Front and the Taliban on the ground. Both sides appear to be saving their ammunition for a ground offensive that's still expected to start within days. The United Front still maintains that the American airstrikes will tip the balance, and eventually the Taliban will lose their grip on power. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, 20 miles north of Kabul in Afghanistan.
In neighboring Pakistan, the government is supporting the U.S. airstrikes and today fired its pro-Taliban military intelligence chief. In some parts of Pakistan, there is support for the Taliban and for Osama bin Laden. CBS's Alan Pizzi reports from the border town of Quetta, where some protesters surged into some streets today.
The backlash had been expected, but the numbers and ferocity of the rioters took even the Pakistani police by surprise. As many as 4,000 pro-Taliban, anti-American demonstrators took over the streets of Quetta today. Their rage was aimed at symbols of authority, a sign of how delicate a line the Pakistani government is treading by supporting the airstrikes. We will fight with the Taliban shoulder to shoulder, this man screams. We will crush the Pakistani and American governments, God willing. The police took that sentiment to heart and fired volleys of tear gas to clear streets. They had to let loose bursts of automatic fire into the air when one of their stations was attacked. A bus was set ablaze. A fire truck that came to help was attacked. Movie houses burned, perhaps because the Taliban forbids movies and TV. Even though the airstrikes had nothing to do with the UN, the rioters besieged a UN compound providing aid to Afghan refugees, and food supplies were torched. The smoke that's rising behind me is from a shopping center that's been set on fire by demonstrators. And what's especially worrying to the police, a senior officer told us, was information that there had been calls in mosques for the faithful to go out and kill foreigners. And it wasn't just in Quetta. Riots broke out in a number of towns along the border with Afghanistan, and police had to counter cries of God is great with volleys of tear gas and greatly increased security. In Peshawar, the riots went on for hours before police regained control. The loyalty of the security forces seemed secure, but shortly before the airstrikes, Pakistani leader General Pervez Musharraf moved to tighten his grip by replacing 2 pro-Taliban generals. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Quetta.
For 2 nights now, U.S. Navy warplanes have crisscrossed the skies over southern Pakistan, flying to Afghanistan and back from aircraft carriers cruising the Arabian Sea, including the USS Enterprise. It's all part of Operation Enduring Freedom. And CBS's Mark Phillips has been observing the action on the flight deck.
On the USS Enterprise, Enduring Freedom took the form of roaring tongues of fire. From somewhere in the Indian Ocean, flights of F-14s and F-18s rocketed into the night sky. The object, the battle group's commander said, was to terrorize the terrorists. Elsewhere in the battle group, cruise missiles had already been fired and were entering Afghan airspace. Along with the fighters, S-3 Viking tankers were launched for in-air refueling. This was a complex mission. And it went on all through the night. The planes left with full weapons payloads, including 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs. An effort, the Enterprise's captain said, to try to limit civilian casualties.
We're not going after innocent victims like the people against whom we're fighting went after in the World Trade Center and elsewhere. We are taking great pains, and sometimes we put ourselves at even greater risk in order to make every effort to avoid civilian casualties.
In the dawn's early light, the planes returned without their payloads. The Enterprise has seen service in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, and patrolling the Iraqi no-fly zone. But on this ship, they said, those battles were different. This, the men and women of the Enterprise say, is a fight in defense of the United States. And one other sign of how this fight is different. From the lowliest seaman on board to the admiral who commands this battle group, there's a new Pentagon rule. Their last names are not to be reported, a precaution against possible terrorist reprisals against their families back home. Mark Phillips, CBS News, aboard the USS Enterprise.
The Enterprise and its battle group are, of course, just part of U.S. naval forces taking part in this campaign. The USS Carl Vinson is also on station in the Arabian Sea, dispatching its own F-14 and F-18 and other warplanes to the fight, and it is accompanied by its own battle group of destroyers, submarines, and support vessels.